My parents told me to sell my house, to pay for my sister's divorce settlement. Now they've lost everything. Sell my house to fund my sister's lavish divorce? Are you kidding me? After years of being the responsible one, my family expected me to give up everything for the sister who never worked a day in her life. But when I refused, oh, they didn't take no for an answer. They tried to manipulate me, blackmail me, even destroy my business. But here's the thing, they underestimated me. And by the time I was done, they were the ones losing everything. Want to know how I turned the tables on them? Keep watching, because this story is about to get crazy. I never thought I'd be here standing in my parents' living room, gripping a lukewarm cup of coffee like it was a lifeline, while my mother's voice rang through the house with all the desperation of a woman clinging to a sinking ship. "Miriam, sweetheart, you know how much your sister has been through," she pleaded, hands clasped together like she was praying for a miracle. She lost everything in this divorce. I clenched my jaw, willing myself to stay calm. I had known this conversation was coming. I'd seen the warning signs, the increasingly frantic phone calls from my mother, the texts from my father that started with, "We need to talk," and Vivienne's cryptic Instagram posts about starting over that conveniently left out how she had burned through every dollar of her divorce settlement in record time. I'd even run into one of her so-called friends at the grocery store who, with the fake sympathy only wealthy socialites could master, tilted her head and sighed, "Poor Vivienne. She's really struggling, you know. She's just not built for a life without support. That's what they were calling it now. I took a slow breath, staring at the woman who raised me. My mother looked so sincere, so heartbroken, but I knew better. She wasn't heartbroken for me. She was devastated that, for the first time in her life, she might actually have to let Vivienne deal with the consequences of her own actions. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice calm, careful. "But I'm not selling my house." The room went so silent I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. My father, who had been sitting in his recliner, let out a slow exhale and finally set down the newspaper he'd been pretending to read. Vivienne, who had been sitting on the couch looking as fragile and pathetic as she could possibly manage, suddenly snapped her head up, her designer-clad shoulders tightening. And then my mother's face crumpled, her lips trembling, and I knew what was coming next. "How can you be so selfish?" she whispered, voice thick with manufactured emotion. There it was. The guilt trip, the weapon of choice in my family. I should have been used to it by now. I should have built up an immunity after years of watching my parents bend over backward for Vivienne, while I was expected to take care of myself. I should have seen this coming the second I heard my mother's voice on the phone last week saying, "Your sister's in a really tough spot right now, honey." But some part of me, some foolish, lingering part, had hoped that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. It wasn't. Selfish? I let out a sharp, humorless laugh, setting my cup down before I accidentally shattered it. I worked 15 years for that house. 15 years of 70-hour work weeks, of scraping by, of saving every penny while Vivienne was flying to Milan to find herself or buying another luxury car because she was bored of the old one. And now I'm supposed to give it up because she spent everything she had? My father let out a low sigh and rubbed his temples like I was the unreasonable one. "It's not just about money, Miriam. It's about family." "Family," I echoed, the word bitter on my tongue. "You mean the same family that has never once had my back? The same family that barely noticed when I was working 2 jobs in college because my tuition fund mysteriously disappeared after Vivienne decided she needed a cultural experience in Paris? The same family that calls my business a little bakery but expects me to bankroll my sister's lifestyle?" Vivienne let out a dramatic sniffle, dabbing at the corner of her eye with a monogrammed silk handkerchief. "I can't believe this," she murmured, voice trembling just enough to sound delicate, but not so much that it ruined her perfectly applied makeup. "I thought you cared about me." I turned to face her fully, my patience wearing dangerously thin. "I do care. That's why I'm telling you the truth. You need to start taking responsibility for your life, Vivienne. Get a job. Learn how to budget. Stop expecting everyone else to clean up your messes. A job? My mother gasped. Like I had suggested, Vivienne join a traveling circus. Miriam, your sister doesn't have any experience. She's never worked a day in her life. I arched an eyebrow. Exactly. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. My mother pressed a hand to her chest like she was experiencing physical pain at the very idea of Vivienne having to function like a normal adult. My father just shook his head, disappointment written all over his face, like I was the one failing the family, not the daughter who had spent her entire life burning through other people's money. I glanced at Vivienne, expecting more tears, more theatrics, but what I saw instead sent a chill down my spine. The vulnerability, the wounded act, it was gone. In its place was something else, something sharp and calculating. She was waiting for my parents to wear me down, waiting for the guilt to settle in, waiting for me to be the responsible one, the good daughter, the one who always caved. But not this time. I stood up, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. I'm done, I said simply. I won't sell my house. I won't fund Vivienne's lifestyle. And if you can't accept that, then maybe we have nothing else to talk about. My mother's breath hitched. My father's jaw tightened. And Vivienne, she smiled. Just a little. Because she knew, just like I did, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I should have known they wouldn't take no for an answer. My family never did. When I left my parents' house that day, I told myself it was over, that I had drawn my line in the sand. But deep down, I knew better. The silence that followed was too unnatural, too calculated. I wasn't dealing with people who accepted boundaries. I was dealing with people who saw them as obstacles to be worn down, chipped away at until I gave in out of exhaustion. The first attack came the next morning. My phone buzzed, nonstop missed calls from my mother, a string of messages from my father, vague but heavy-handed reminders about family loyalty and doing what's right. I ignored them at first, pouring myself into work, kneading dough with a little more force than necessary as I prepped for the morning rush at my bakery. But then came the texts from relatives, some from people I hadn't spoken to in years. Miriam, your mother is heartbroken. Your sister is devastated. How can you turn your back on family? I heard you refused to help. That doesn't sound like you. The guilt tripping had officially gone public. By noon, I was done playing nice. I typed out a single response and sent it to everyone who had messaged me. Vivienne is not my responsibility. If you care so much, why don't you sell your house? That shut most of them up. But I knew my parents well enough to know they weren't done yet. This was just the warm-up. The real fight hadn't even begun. It came later that evening. I had just locked up the bakery and was halfway through scraping icing off the countertop when my phone rang. I glanced at the screen, Dad. I sighed, debating whether to answer. Letting it go to voicemail would be easier, but some part of me, some old habit of obedience, made me pick up. His voice was calm, measured, but I could hear the tension underneath. Miriam, we need to talk. I closed my eyes, already tired. Dad, if this is about the house, not over the phone. His tone sharpened. Come by the house. It's important. I almost refused. Almost told him that whatever it was, it could wait. Or better yet, not happen at all. But something in his voice unsettled me. So against my better judgment, I went. The moment I stepped into my parents' house, I knew I had walked into an ambush. My mother sat stiffly in her usual spot on the couch, hands folded tightly in her lap. My father stood near the fireplace, arms crossed, jaw tight. And Vivienne. She was perched delicately in the armchair, looking like a tragic heroine in some melodrama, her eyes red-rimmed but suspiciously dry. Sit down, my father said. I didn't. He exhaled through his nose, slow and deliberate, like he was preparing himself. There's something you should know. My mother pressed her lips together, glancing at him before looking back at me. Your father and I. We spoke with Aunt Harriet today. My stomach twisted. Aunt Harriet. I hadn't heard her name in years. Not since that summer in college when I'd stayed at her house for 3 months. That summer when I had accidentally stumbled upon something I wasn't supposed to see, something that, at the time, I had been too young and naive to fully understand. I kept my face neutral, and my father's fingers drummed against the mantel. She remembers some concerning details about that time, about what you saw. The words settled like lead in my stomach. So this was it. The real leverage. They weren't going to guilt me into submission, they were going to blackmail me. I forced a casual shrug. And my mother's gaze turned sharp, calculating, and it would be a shame if certain things were to come to light now, especially considering that your cousin Theodore is in the middle of a very important campaign. Ah, there it was. The threat wrapped in a veil of concern. The unspoken "do what we want," or "we'll make sure this ruins you." I let out a slow breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. "So let me get this straight," I said, voice steady. "You're threatening to ruin my reputation over something that happened almost 2 decades ago? Over something I wasn't even involved in?" My father's expression darkened. "It's not about threats, Miriam. It's about understanding consequences. Consequences. Right. The same kind they had never let Vivienne face a day in her life." I took a step forward, lowering my voice. "You really think I don't have leverage too?" I pulled my phone from my pocket, unlocking it with a few quick taps. "Because I've been doing a little digging of my own." My father stilled. My mother's eyes flickered with uncertainty. Even Vivienne, so smug just moments ago, suddenly looked less sure of herself. I turned the screen toward them. "Funny thing about small towns," I mused. "People talk? And records? They're not as easy to erase as you might think." My father's face paled as he stared at the emails I had pulled up, correspondence between him and a certain city official, regarding a few real estate deals that had been expedited under questionable circumstances. Deals that had put money into the wrong pockets. My mother gasped. "Where did you get those?" I ignored her, swiping to the next file. "And look at this," I continued. "Vivienne's business expenses. 70 grand of investor money that somehow ended up funding a luxury vacation and a new car." Vivienne shot up from her chair, face red. "That's none of your, exactly." I met her glare, unwavering. "Just like my house is none of yours." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. I let them sit in it for a moment before slipping my phone back into my pocket. "So here's what's going to happen," I said, voice steady. "You're going to drop this ridiculous demand. You're going to stop harassing me. And if you so much as breathe a word about that summer to anyone, I promise you this." I gestured toward my phone. "Goes straight to the press." My father looked like he might actually explode. My mother was shaking. Vivienne had gone silent, eyes darting between them, looking for some sign of how they were going to handle this. I didn't wait for an answer. I turned on my heel, heading for the door. But just as I reached for the handle, my father's voice stopped me. "This isn't over, Miriam." I smiled, but it wasn't a kind one. "No," I agreed, glancing over my shoulder. "It's just getting started." And with that, I walked out, leaving them scrambling in the wreckage of their own making. They thought they had me cornered. My parents, my sister, everyone was against me, pressuring me to give in. But what they didn't know was that I had a plan. And when I walked into that family meeting, I wasn't the one being ambushed. I was the one setting the trap. "So tell me, if you were in my shoes, what would you do? Would you first expose their dirty secrets in front of everyone? Second, walk away and cut them off completely? Comment 1 or 2 below, and let's see if you would have handled it the way I did." I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind replayed the conversation with my parents, the tension thick enough to choke on. Their audacity, their sheer nerve to think they could blackmail me into submission, was almost laughable if it weren't so damn infuriating. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I went over every detail, every threat, every unspoken promise of retaliation they had thrown my way. I knew them well enough to understand this wasn't over. It never was with them. My refusal was just the opening act. The real battle was about to begin. By morning, my phone was already vibrating with messages. My mother had apparently gone into full crisis mode, reaching out to every relative, every family friend, painting me as the heartless, ungrateful daughter who had abandoned her own sister in her darkest hour. A few texts were filled with fake concern. Miriam, your mom is so upset. Maybe you should reconsider, but most were pure, unfiltered guilt trips. What happened to you? You've changed. Family is supposed to come first. How can you let Vivienne suffer like this? I tossed my phone onto the kitchen counter, more irritated than surprised. They were predictable, if nothing else. But their tactics weren't going to work on me. Not this time. I poured myself a cup of coffee, took a long sip, and exhaled. They wanted a fight? Fine. Let's see how they handled it when I fought back. I spent the next few hours at the bakery, but my mind was somewhere else, running through everything I knew about my family, their secrets, their weaknesses. Because if they thought they were the only ones holding leverage, they were about to learn otherwise. I had spent years biting my tongue, keeping the peace while they pushed me aside. But now I was done playing nice. The first thing I did was call an old friend, someone I knew could help me dig deeper. Madison worked in finance and had a knack for uncovering things that people preferred to keep buried. She picked up on the first ring. "Long time no talk," she said, amusement laced in her voice. "What's up? I need a favor," I said, getting straight to the point. There was a pause. "The last time you said that, we ended up sneaking into a corporate gala to expose a fraud. And we succeeded," I reminded her. "True," she admitted. "All right. What are we looking for?" I hesitated for only a second before answering. Anything on my father's real estate dealings. Specifically, anything shady. Madison let out a low whistle. "Oh, this sounds fun. Give me a couple of days." "Thanks," I said, already feeling a small weight lift off my shoulders. Next, I turned my attention to Vivienne. My sister had spent years floating through life on other people's money, but she wasn't as careful as she thought she was. I remembered hearing whispers about her failed businesses, about the mysterious disappearance of investor funds, but no one had ever dared to confront her about it because why would they? She was Vivienne, the golden child, the one who always landed on her feet. I sat down at my laptop, pulled up the last known business venture she had attempted, a boutique interior design firm that had crashed and burned within months. It didn't take long to find the financial records. Sloppy, incomplete. But what stood out the most was the sudden withdrawal of $70,000 from the business account, right before the company officially folded. Where had that money gone? I already had a good guess. I kept digging, my fingers flying over the keyboard, pulling up old social media posts, cross-referencing dates, piecing together a timeline. Sure enough, the missing money coincided perfectly with a luxury trip to Italy, a brand new car, and a suspiciously well-timed shopping spree. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. If she thought she could play the victim, she had another thing coming. The final piece of my plan came unexpectedly. I was going through my old emails when I stumbled upon something I had forgotten about, a message from an old acquaintance who used to work in city zoning. It was brief, but it mentioned a favor my father had pulled to get a property, rezoned, a favor that had made him a lot of money and had conveniently been kept off the books. I knew this wasn't solid proof, but it was a lead. And in my experience, where there was smoke, there was fire. By the time I closed my laptop, I had everything I needed. I wasn't just going to defend myself. I was going to make sure that the next time my family even thought about coming after me, they would remember this moment and regret it. They had underestimated me. That was their first mistake. And soon, they'd realize it was their biggest. The next morning, I woke up to a pounding headache and a sense of unease curling in my stomach. I wasn't sure if it was from the lack of sleep or the weight of what I was about to do, but either way, there was no turning back now. I had spent years keeping my mouth shut, swallowing my pride, and letting my family get away with things that should have been exposed a long time ago. But this wasn't about childhood grievances anymore. This was about survival. If they thought they could corner me, manipulate me, blackmail me into submission, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. I checked my phone, half expecting another barrage of messages, but it was oddly silent, too silent. My parents didn't back down this easily. That only meant one thing: they were planning something. I threw on a sweater, grabbed my keys, and headed to my bakery, needing the comfort of routine. The feeling of flour dusting my fingertips, the scent of fresh bread filling the air. But even as I kneaded dough, shaping it with practiced hands, my mind kept circling back to the storm that was brewing. I didn't have to wait long for it to hit. It started with a customer, one of my regulars, a sweet older woman named Diane, who had been coming in for years. She lingered at the counter longer than usual, shifting from foot to foot like she was working up the courage to say something. Finally, she cleared her throat. "Honey, I don't mean to pry, but is everything all right?" I frowned, dusting flour off my hands. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, lowering her voice. "I was at my book club last night, and well, you know how small this town is. Word gets around fast." A cold prickle ran down my spine. Word about what? Diane looked genuinely uncomfortable now, like she regretted bringing it up. "Your mother. She was talking to some people. Said she was worried about you, that you've been acting strange lately, shutting out family. She even hinted that maybe you were going through some financial trouble." I stared at her, barely breathing. Financial trouble. My mother was laying the groundwork for something big. I forced a smile, even as my blood ran hot. "I appreciate you telling me, Diane, but I can assure you I'm doing just fine." She patted my hand, giving me a look of sympathy that made my stomach turn. "I just thought you should know." I nodded, watching her leave, then immediately grabbed my phone and dialed Madison. She picked up on the second ring. "Tell me you have something." "Oh, I have plenty," she said, sounding almost gleeful. "But you're not going to like it. Try me." Madison sighed. "Your dad's been playing a dangerous game. That reasoning favor he pulled, turns out it wasn't just a small nudge in the right direction. He funneled money through a fake consulting firm, one that just happened to be registered under an old business partner's name." I felt my jaw tighten. "So it's fraud." "Textbook fraud," she confirmed. "And if anyone were to, say, tip off the right people, he'd be looking at a major investigation." I pinched the bridge of my nose. "Anything on Vivienne?" "Oh, she's just as bad. That 70 grand she borrowed from her investors. Turns out it didn't just go to shopping sprees. She also used it to cover some gambling debts." I nearly choked. "Gambling? Yeah. And not the friendly poker night kind. The kind where if you don't pay up, people start showing up at your door." I sat down hard, gripping the edge of the counter. My family had always been a mess, but this was worse than I had expected. Madison hesitated. "Look, Miriam, I know you're pissed and you have every right to be, but are you sure you want to go through with this? Because if you do, there's no coming back from it." I thought about that for a long moment, staring at the half-finished loaves of bread in front of me, the ones I had spent the morning shaping with care. This bakery was mine, my life's work, the one thing no one had ever been able to take from me. And yet, if my family had their way, they would burn it all down just to get what they wanted. I exhaled slowly. "I don't have a choice, Mads. They're coming for me whether I fight back or not. At least this way, I'm not walking into the fire unarmed." There was a pause, then a quiet chuckle. "Well, in that case, I hope you're ready. Because once this starts, it's going to get ugly." I tightened my grip on my phone, my resolve hardening. Let it. The storm hit the next morning, and I wasn't the least bit surprised. I had been waiting for it, bracing myself like a soldier standing on the front lines, knowing the battle was about to begin. The silence after my last conversation with Madison had been too long, too calculated. My family wasn't the type to let things go, and I knew they were working behind the scenes, crafting their next move. They had underestimated me before, but now Now, I was ready. It started with a phone call from my landlord. Not the one for my house, but for my bakery. I answered on the second ring, wiping flour from my hands as I balanced my phone between my ear and shoulder. "Miriam," Mr. Hendricks said, his voice unusually formal. "I just got off the phone with someone your father." I froze. My father hadn't spoken to Mr. Hendricks in years. Not since he begrudgingly co-signed my first lease when I started the business. "What did he say?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. There was a pause. "He expressed concern," Hendricks said carefully. "Said he heard you might be having financial trouble. Asked if I'd consider selling the building to a family friend who was willing to take it off my hands." My stomach dropped. That bastard. He was trying to cut me off at the knees. I forced a dry laugh. "Well, I can assure you I'm fine. My rent payments have never been late, and my business is doing just fine." "I know," Hendricks said, sighing. I told him that. "But, Miriam, you might want to be careful. Your father is a very persuasive man." I hung up, my pulse pounding. So this was their next move? Smearing my reputation, planting seeds of doubt, trying to make me look unstable so they could swoop in and help by taking everything from me? I shouldn't have been shocked, but somehow the sheer audacity of it made my blood boil. By the time I got to my office in the back of the bakery, my hands were shaking not from fear, but from fury. They wanted to play dirty? Fine. I could get dirty too. I grabbed my phone and called Madison. She picked up instantly. "They're trying to buy out my landlord," I snapped. "Of course they are," she muttered. "What's the play?" I ran a hand through my hair, thinking fast. "Can you get me a meeting with someone at the local paper? I need a journalist who isn't afraid to piss off the wrong people." Madison let out a low whistle. "Going nuclear already?" I exhaled sharply. "They're trying to take my business, Mads. I'm not just rolling over and letting it happen." She was quiet for a moment. "Then, I'll set it up." I hung up, shoving my phone into my pocket just as the front bell of the bakery chimed. Vivienne. She stood in the doorway, her blonde hair perfectly curled, her designer sunglasses perched on top of her head, like she had just stepped off the set of some reality show about privileged housewives. But her eyes were cold, calculating. I folded my arms. "What do you want, Vivienne?" She gave me a slow, pitying smile. "You know, Miriam, I really thought you'd be smarter about this." I let out a humorless laugh. "Smarter? You mean obedient?" Her smile didn't waver, but I saw the flicker of irritation in her expression. "You're making things so much harder than they need to be," she said, stepping inside and lowering her voice. "Mom and Dad just want what's best for everyone. Why are you fighting so hard against it?" "Because what's best always means what's best for you," I shot back. "And I'm done playing that game." Vivienne sighed dramatically, shaking her head. "You always did have a martyr complex. Acting like you're some self-made woman who never got any help from this family." I took a step forward, lowering my voice to match hers. "I am a self-made woman, Vivienne. The only thing this family has ever done for me is remind me, over and over again, that I will never be as important as you." Her jaw tightened. "You're making a mistake." "No," I said calmly. "I'm fixing one." She let out a breath, shaking her head like I was some lost cause. "Dad said you'd be stubborn, but I really thought you had more sense than this." I stared at her, waiting. Then she smiled, slow and smug. "Well," she said, tilting her head, "I guess I'll see you at dinner on Saturday." My stomach clenched. She saw the flicker of recognition on my face and laughed softly. "Oh, you didn't know?" she cooed. "Mom's hosting a family dinner. Everyone's coming. It's going to be so nice to have everyone together again." I knew exactly what this was. A trap. A carefully orchestrated intervention where they would surround me with relatives, guilt-trip me into submission, break me down in front of an audience, so that by the end of the night, I'd be worn down enough to agree to whatever they wanted. It was their final move. I exhaled slowly, schooling my features into indifference. "Can't wait," I said flatly. Vivian's smile widened. "Good. See you then." She turned on her heel and sauntered out, her designer heels clicking against the tile floor. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty doorway, my pulse thrumming in my ears. They thought they had the upper hand. They thought I was going to walk into that house unprepared. Let them corner me. Let them break me down. They had no idea what was coming. I wasn't walking into an ambush. I was walking into war. One spent the next few days preparing, not just emotionally, not just mentally, but strategically, because I knew exactly what was going to happen at that dinner. I had seen this play out before, had been on the receiving end of their coordinated ambushes too many times to count. The script was always the same. My parents would position themselves as the wise, long-suffering arbiters of fairness. Vivienne would play the fragile victim, and the rest of the family, either out of genuine belief or just blind loyalty, would pile on, pressuring me from every angle. They would talk about duty, about sacrifice, about how I was being difficult, selfish, heartless. They would twist the truth until I was the villain and Vivienne was the wounded dove in need of saving. But they weren't the only ones who knew how to put on a show. I spent the first night after Vivienne's visit barely sleeping, my mind racing with every possible angle they could take, every possible counter I could prepare. By morning, I had a plan. If they wanted to drag this into the public eye, if they wanted to make it a grand spectacle, then I was going to use that against them. I gathered everything. The first thing I did was pull my bank statements, every rent payment I had made, every bill I had covered, every investment I had made in my bakery. I compiled emails, contracts, and receipts, proof that no one had ever helped me in any meaningful way, despite what my parents liked to claim. Then I turned my attention to Vivienne's finances. The missing 70 grand? I tracked down every suspicious expense I could find. Luxury shopping sprees, hotel stays, 5-star dinners, all during the exact time period when she was supposedly drowning in debt. I even found the exact transaction where she wired money to a known gambling fixer, one who was later investigated for laundering money. Then came my father's real estate dealings. Madison had already sent me a neatly organized file of his most questionable transactions, shady rezoning deals, backroom approvals, and a series of well-timed consulting fees that all pointed to one thing: corruption. And finally, the photos. I dug through old albums, old Facebook posts, anything that showed the stark difference between how my family had treated me and how they had treated Vivienne. Vacations I wasn't invited to, Christmases where she was showered with gifts while I got a polite card. My graduation party, if you could call it, that overshadowed by her engagement announcement. By the time I finished, I had a weaponized timeline of evidence, a decade-long record of how I had been pushed aside, dismissed, and used, and I wasn't going to waste it. On the night of the dinner, I dressed with precision. Nothing flashy, nothing too severe, just a simple black dress and my grandmother's pearl necklace. A quiet reminder of the one family member who had ever treated me as an equal. My parents' house was already packed when I arrived, every cousin, every aunt and uncle, even a few distant relatives who usually only showed up for weddings and funerals. A full audience. Perfect. The second I stepped inside, my mother swept toward me, wrapping me in a carefully staged hug. "Miriam, sweetheart, I'm so glad you're here," she said, her voice just loud enough for the room to hear. "We were all so worried about you." Right, because I was the problem. I let her pull me into the living room, where everyone was already seated, murmuring in low voices. My father stood at the head of the room, looking every bit the composed patriarch, his expression one of patient disappointment. And there, sitting at the center of it all, was Vivienne, her eyes red, her hands delicately folded in her lap, a picture-perfect damsel in distress. It was almost impressive how well they had staged it. Almost. My father cleared his throat, commanding the room's attention. "Before we eat, I think it's important we have a conversation as a family." he said, his voice smooth, practiced. Miriam, your behavior lately has been concerning to all of us. We don't understand why you're being so resistant to helping your sister. I let the silence stretch. Let them think they were in control. Then, I smiled. Actually, I said, reaching into my bag, I have something to share first. I pulled out my tablet and connected it to the TV, the same TV where we had watched holiday movies, family slideshows, memories now tainted by the knowledge that I had never truly been part of their version of family. The screen lit up. Let's start with some numbers, I said, keeping my voice light, almost conversational. This is what I paid for my house. Here's my mortgage history showing every payment I've made by myself, without help from anyone in this room. A ripple of discomfort moved through the crowd. My mother shifted uneasily. My father's fingers twitched. I clicked to the next slide. And this is Vivienne's business account. You might notice something interesting, $70,000 gone in under 3 months. None of it spent on actual business expenses. Vivienne shot up from her chair. Those were business expenses, she shrieked. I clicked again. The screen now showed bank statements, expensive hotel stays, boutique shopping, wire transfers to known gambling associates. Really? I mused, tilting my head. Because this looks a lot more like embezzlement. The room erupted. My father stood abruptly, his face red with barely contained fury. My mother looked like she might faint. My cousins whispered furiously among themselves, some of them staring at Vivienne in open shock. But I wasn't done. I clicked again. This time, emails filled the screen, my father's correspondence with city officials, conversations about rezoning properties in exchange for under-the-table fees. The campaign manager for my cousin Theodore, who had been nodding along sympathetically just moments ago, suddenly looked very, very interested. The silence was deafening. I let it hang in the air before delivering the final blow. I came here tonight because I thought we were going to have an honest conversation about family, I said, my voice steady. But let's be real. This wasn't about family. This was about control, about manipulation, about using me again. My father took a step toward me, his voice dangerously low. Miriam, no, I cut him off. We're done. I turned on my heel and walked toward the door, feeling a weight lift off my chest with every step. For the first time in my life, I wasn't running away. I was walking away and leaving them behind for good. I had barely made it halfway across the driveway when I heard my father's voice, low and sharp, cutting through the night like a blade. Miriam. I didn't stop, didn't slow down. My heels clicked against the pavement, each step feeling lighter, freer. But then I heard his footsteps behind me, quick and purposeful. Miriam, don't you dare walk away from this, he hissed. I turned, slowly, keeping my expression calm even though my pulse was hammering against my ribs. The front door was still open behind him, spilling warm light onto the porch, casting long shadows across his face. Inside, I could hear the muffled chaos, my mother's panicked voice, my cousins whispering, Vivienne's shrill protests. Good. Let them scramble. Let them choke on the mess they created. I folded my arms. Why not? You and Mom have spent my entire life making it clear that I was never a priority. So, tell me, Dad, why should I stand here and listen now? His jaw tightened. Because you're making a mistake. A mistake you're going to regret. I laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. Oh, I regret a lot of things. I regret every time I let you guilt me into doing something I didn't want to do. I regret every time I let you and Mom rewrite history to make Vivienne look like the victim while I was cast as the cold, ungrateful sister. But this, I gestured between us, this is the first thing I've done that I don't regret. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You don't know what you're doing. Actually, I said, tilting my head, I think for the first time in my life, I do. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his graying hair. For the first time that night, he looked worried, really, truly worried. He had spent decades crafting his image, making sure the world saw him as the respected businessman, the upstanding patriarch. But now, that image was teetering. I had shaken its foundation, and he knew it. "You think this changes anything?" he said. Finally, his voice softer now, more measured. "You think you've won some kind of battle?" He shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You don't understand how the world works, Miriam. Family is everything. You turn your back on that, and you'll find yourself completely alone." I let out a slow breath, steadying myself. "You know, Dad, I used to believe that. I used to think that no matter how bad things got, no matter how many times you and Mom put Vivian first, I had to stay. Because that's what family does, right? They forgive, they overlook, they sacrifice." I shook my head, my voice steady. But all this time, I was the only one sacrificing. The only one compromising. "And you never saw me as family, did you?" "Not really. I was just the backup plan, the one you kept on the sidelines just in case." He opened his mouth, but I held up a hand, stopping him. "No," I said, my voice firm. "I am done being the backup plan." A muscle ticked in his jaw. "And what now? You think you're free? You think you can just walk away, and this all goes away?" I stared at him, feeling something shift inside me, something final and unshakable. "Yes," I said simply. "I do." I turned and walked away, feeling the cool night air against my skin, feeling the weight of years of guilt and obligation finally slipping from my shoulders. I didn't look back. I was free. I barely made it to my car before my phone started buzzing. I didn't have to look at the screen to know who it was. My mother. My father. Vivienne. Maybe even some meddling relative who thought they could play peacemaker. I ignored it, shoving my keys into the ignition with a sharp twist. The engine rumbled to life, and I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My breath was uneven, my chest tight, but I refused to cry. Not here, not now, not over them. The truth was, I had won. I had gone into that house fully prepared to be ambushed, manipulated, dragged under by years of guilt. But instead, I had flipped the script. I had exposed them. I had taken control. And yet, there was still that tiny, treacherous voice in the back of my mind, whispering, "What if they find a way to twist this? What if they still win?" No, not this time. I pulled out of the driveway, watching my parents' house shrink in my rearview mirror. I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt invincible. But I knew my family too well. They weren't the type to accept defeat gracefully. They weren't just going to let this go. My phone buzzed again and again. Then, a text. "Mom, Miriam, stop this. You've hurt this family enough. Come back inside and fix this." I let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Fix this. As if I had been the one breaking things. As if I had been the one setting fire to everything just to watch it burn. Another buzz. "Vivienne, you have no idea what you've done." That one made my stomach turn, but I refused to let it show. Instead, I threw my phone into the passenger seat and focused on the road ahead. By the time I got home, I was exhausted. Not just physically, but emotionally, mentally. The kind of exhaustion that seeped into your bones, making even the smallest movements feel heavy. I locked my front door, leaned against it for a moment, and let out a slow breath. Then I turned on my phone. The flood of messages was worse than I expected. Dozens of missed calls, texts from people I hadn't spoken to in years, all variations of the same thing. "How could you do this? Your poor parents. Your poor sister." Some were nastier than others, dripping with barely concealed judgment. Others were more subtle, laced with fake concern. But the worst one wasn't from my parents or from Vivienne. It was from my landlord, "Mr. Hendricks, Miriam, we need to talk. Call me as soon as you get this." I felt my stomach drop. I called him immediately, my pulse thrumming in my ears. He picked up on the second ring. "Miriam," he said, sighing, "I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I need to be upfront with you. I gripped the phone tighter. What's going on? There was a pause. Your father made another offer. I closed my eyes. Of course he had. Of course, after everything, he was still trying to rip my life out from under me. And, Hendricks hesitated, it's substantial. I swallowed hard. Are you considering it? He sighed again, heavier this time. Look, I like you, Miriam. I respect what you've built, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't tempted. This is a business, and he's making it very hard to say no. My heart pounded in my chest. This wasn't just about money. This was about control. My father didn't just want me to sell my house. He wanted to take everything from me. Please, I said, my voice quieter now, steadier. I just need time. Whatever he's offering you, I'll find a way to match it. Another long silence. You have a week, Hendricks said finally. After that, I have to make the best decision for myself. I nodded even though he couldn't see me. Thank you. We hung up, and I sat there in my dark living room, the weight of it all pressing down on me. A week. I had 1 week to come up with enough money to stop my father from taking my business. 1 week to keep the one thing I had fought for, bled for, sacrificed for. 1 week to prove to all of them that I wasn't the weak, obedient daughter they thought I was. I wasn't just going to fight. I was going to win. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning through every scenario, every possibility, every way this could play out. My father had made his move. He wasn't just trying to take my house, he was coming for my business. The one thing that had ever been truly mine. The one thing I had built with my own hands, with my own sweat, with every ounce of energy I had left after years of being cast aside. He wasn't just trying to win, he was trying to erase me. But he had underestimated me. By morning, I had a plan. I spent the next few days working nonstop, reaching out to everyone I knew, mentors, business connections, even old customers who had supported my bakery from the beginning. I secured an emergency loan, just enough to match his offer. I contacted Madison, who, bless her, had already anticipated this and had lined up a few journalists hungry for a scandal. And then I did something I had never done before. I fought back. I went public. I exposed everything. I didn't just release the information about my father's shady real estate deals. I gave it to the right people. City officials, local reporters, people who had been waiting for an excuse to take him down. I made sure there was a spotlight on every single corrupt transaction he had ever made. And I did it without warning him. The fallout was immediate. By the end of the week, my father's business was under investigation. His name, once respected, once untouchable, was being dragged through the mud in every local paper. My mother, once the proud socialite, stopped showing her face at the country club. Vivienne, oh, poor, sweet Vivienne, was left scrambling, her carefully curated world crumbling around her. And me? I bought my bakery's building outright. When my father called me, because of course he did, I let it go to voicemail. When my mother showed up at my house, tears in her eyes, begging me to fix this, I shut the door in her face. When Vivienne texted me, "You ruined everything," I laughed. I had spent a lifetime being the family's scapegoat, the responsible one, the one who always caved, always gave in, always let them take and take and take. But not anymore. I was done. And for the first time in my life, I was free. They tried to break me. They thought they could guilt me, manipulate me, and take everything I had worked for. But instead, I walked away with my business, my house, and my freedom. And them? My father lost his reputation, my sister lost her perfect life, and my mother lost the control she thought she had over me. So here's my question for you. When is enough enough? When do you stop letting family use you? Comment below if you've ever had to cut off toxic relatives. Let's talk about it, because trust me, you are not alone. In America, we're taught that family is everything. But what they don't tell you is that family doesn't mean sacrifice at your own expense. It doesn't mean letting people manipulate you, steal from you, or control your life just because you share blood. I learned the hard way that setting boundaries isn't selfish, it's survival. Your success is yours, your hard work is yours, and anyone who truly loves you will respect that. So stand your ground, walk away if you have to, because the people who demand your loyalty without earning it, they were never your family to begin with,